Bienvenue tout le monde, je m'appelle Ryan Katrosine, je suis professeur adjoint ici à l'École d'études politiques. I'm Ryan Katrosine, I'm a professor here at the School of Political Studies, and I'm really excited. It's really great to see such a good turnout for this talk today on the quiet failures of neoliberalism with my colleague Jackie Best, who was one of the founding members of the International Political Economy Network, which is the organization, if you will, that is hosting this talk as part of the broader Center for International Policy Studies, or CIPS. Without further ado, please do join me in welcoming Professor Jackie Best.
Bon, un gros merci, Ryan. Donc, je vous souhaite tous et toutes la bienvenue. Je vous propose un discours en anglais, mais je serai tout à fait contente de répondre à des questions en français. I will start with that and let you know that. I wanted to also thank, in addition to thanking Ryan, thank Rita and Anna and Carolyn also for helping organize and put this event together. It's just a delight to present some of this work to my colleagues and community here at the University of Ottawa. So this one I'm presenting to you today is part of very much a work in progress. So I'm very much interested in your views and perspectives. And it's something that has been funded by a short grant that has taken me into the archives, something I've done in the past, but I've been spending a lot more time hiding out in the archives than before, looking at some recently declassified material from the early Reagan and Thatcher years, and trying to make sense of and puzzle through the early days of neoliberalism. And part of the goal here is to sort of, like many people here perhaps, I'm puzzled, dismayed at some of what the contemporary politics, and one of my quick responses is often to try to go back into the past and to try to make sense of how we got here, and that's what I've been trying to do. So I've been interested in the question of failure, I'm going to talk about today, for the last few years, and not just because I'm now a parent, and a parent of twins. Failure, and parents in the room are probably very familiar with this, is something we're confronted with regularly. My last book, though, was called Governing Failure, and looked at how the IMF and the World Bank confronted very public policy failures in the late 90s and early 2000s, and tried to make sense of how they changed, how they governed as a result. But more recently, I've become interested in a very different kind of failure. Not those big ones, not the big public ones that resonate, that change policy, but rather the failures that don't take over the headlines, the ones that don't get written into the history books. They get hushed up, or ignored, or forgotten. These are what I'm calling quiet failures. And even though we might see them as quite profound, I think the reason they're quiet is that their political salience has actually been quite muted. As you'll see from the smiling faces on the screen, I am going to be focusing on historical failures, okay, specifically the early years of the Thatcher and Reagan administrations, but my interest in the question of quiet failures is not entirely historical, because I think there are some rather recent, well, at least one rather recent example that anyone who's been interested in the international political economy will probably remember, right, the 2008 global financial crisis. It is not hard to come up with images that remind us of how the global financial crisis and its long aftermath exposed many of the failings of neoliberalism. And yet, 10 years on, what's most striking is how quiet those failures have been, how few of those failures have actually translated into meaningful changes. So why do certain failures not count as such, at least in political terms? When do failures count, and how? And what do these quiet failures, the existence of these quiet failures that don't resonate politically, what do they tell us? So many serious scholars have tackled these questions and come up with plausible answers. So one possible answer to this question is, well, if you're coming at this from a Marxist perspective, you might say, well, crisis is inherent in capitalism. Crises are used frequently to justify more authoritarian maneuvers. People like Ian Brough and others have worked on this recently and looked at authoritarian neoliberalism. And from this perspective, failure is a feature. It's not a bug, right? We should expect failure. We should expect crisis. It's something, it's actually useful in some ways. There's also a growing literature coming out of both sort of constructivist and postmodernist perspectives that really talks instead about the resilience of neoliberalism, So from this perspective, the argument is that part of what makes neoliberalism is its plasticity, its fungibility, its irrefutability. Okay, so this is just, again, neoliberalism being neoliberalism once again. Now, I find all these perspectives very insightful, but I do, this question that keeps nagging at me is there's something rather inevitable about this story. You know, that yes, neoliberalism keeps failing, and yes, it keeps failing forwards, to use Jamie Peck's wonderful term. You know, but my question is, does it always, in fact, fail forwards? Maybe we need to complicate that rather smooth history and look a little more closely at these failures and what they have done and haven't done, rather than just assuming that neoliberalism is an energizer bunny, or this trajectory that never ends. Let's unpack this a little more carefully. So I want to complicate this smooth conception of the role of failure in neoliberalism by taking a closer look at some of the earliest failures of this neoliberalism, or earliest failures of efforts to translate theory into practice in the Reagan and Thatcher administrations. These moments are often narrated as these enormous successes, and of course, Reagan and Thatcher had a profound impact on the global economy and the political economy. There is no question of that. But again, I think we need to look more carefully. I don't know about you guys, but I was taught that this was a decisive moment, mano a mano, right? Where basically, Friedman went against Keynes and Friedman won, okay? And more than that, monetarism won out over Keynesianism, and that was sort of the end of the story. And we can tell in the textbooks I teach my students, will use this framework in comparative political economy. We draw it also from the work of great scholars of economic ideas like Peter Hall, right? Who talks about the shift in paradigms and how this is an important shift from the Keynesian to the monetarist paradigm. But of course, at the same time as we use that language, the language is in fact highly misleading. And again, most historians of economics or people will know this, right? That monetarism itself actually failed, and failed very rapidly and very decisively. It was introduced in the United States in 1979, ended in 1982. In Canada, we were ahead of the curve. Friedman thought we were one of the good kids on the block. It was, I think, 75 we introduced monetarism. We also gave up in 1982, and the Brits gave up also under Thatcher just a little bit after that. Now, it's interesting, in spite of that very obvious failure, that at least the stories that we tell tend to smooth it over. They either forget it or they smooth it over. I think that speaks to the plasticity of neoliberalism on the one hand, but it also, I think, downplays the potential importance of that failure and of many others that, in fact, face the early ideas of central to neoliberalism. Now, I'm not the only one who's been talking about this recently, so I'm part of a wider group of scholars, people like Greta Krippner, Van Clift, Mark Blythe has been revisiting some of his earlier work, who are really trying to complicate this notion of a clear transition from one economic paradigm to another, and these sort of accounts of coherence and rupture. And I think I'm very much a part of that picture. But at the same time, what I'm arguing, what I'm going to suggest today, is to really appreciate the complexity and the fragility of early neoliberalism. It's not enough to look at these big ideas, Keynesianism, neoliberalism, monetarism, and so, or neoliberalism. We need to actually look at more practical, sort of real ideas, I've called them elsewhere. But beyond that, and the pitch I'm going to make to you today, is to really understand how ideas work. We need to look beyond the ideational and look at concrete practices, the ways in which policymakers seek to translate ideas into practice, how they produce, how they circulate, how they gain adherence. So I would argue when we look at this practical life of ideas and pay attention to these quiet failures, we find, in fact, that ideas don't work the way that we think they do. I want to take that apart in particular. So I'm really emphasizing the idea of the work that ideas do. Now, I think to help us think that through, we can look at this famous ad, somewhat before my time, but I think resonates still today, right? And this was a conservative ad by Saatchi and Saatchi that during the election that actually got Thatcher into power, right? And they famously argued labor isn't working. And of course here there's a play on words, but I think that play on words is actually worth unpacking, right? It's the idea that the labor's ideas aren't working. These were the ideas that Thatcher and others were trying to challenge. Okay, but also that the labor government wasn't working, and of course therefore that in practice people weren't working. right? The ideas were not translating effectively into practice. And I want to focus on that effort of translation, of translating ideas into practice. And I want to say what I'm talking about then is not simply theory versus practice to suggest that somehow practice is more important, or theory as practice, which I think, we can certainly, theories can be practices, but rather I want to talk about the concrete practical life of theories as policymakers try to make them work in the world. So how do we study this? I draw inspiration here, as I've done in some of my other work, from a useful set of insights from a rather different field. That is, drawing on the early work of Bruno Latour and Steve Woolgar before actor network theory became a big thing, right? And they were really just trying to understand how life works in the lab, maybe that kind of lab, but how scientific labs actually work to transform to create scientific ideas and to turn them into facts and make them do work out in the world. Now, I think there's really interesting parallels to think about how that links with economic ideas. Now, I don't know that image. I Googled economists at work, and I got that. So apparently that's what economists do. They sit around in suits, and they point at bar graphs. I think there are some economists here you can tell me is this right or wrong, but there you go. That's apparently the practical work of economists. But obviously, if you want to think about what are the tools, the techniques, right, the instruments, they are often actually models, right, that are trying to take these ideas and to make them work in the world, in the real world out there. Here we have two that were two models were very important in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. The long-run Phillips curve, which sort of challenged the Keynesian notion of a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And as I will get to later, the rather hilarious Laffer curve, which promised tax cuts with no deficits. But these are the kinds of, I think these are the kinds of tools. So labs in that sense are not as straightforward as we think, and I think it's worth drawing up, same with economic ideas of how this works. I want to say we've done as a field, certainly in international economy, we've done a very good job, I think, of talking about the power of ideas and the role of economic ideas. But I want to focus instead, or understand them in relation to these very specific devices and techniques, the ways of recording, of making facts do work for us, and try to look at their successes and failures in trying to translate theory into practice. So one of the things I think is so interesting about doing this kind of work is that, I'm a scholar in political economy who's always interested in the role of ideas. But what I really like about this is the way in which I think it forces us to break down distinctions between ideas and materiality. So science and technology scholars, I always love putting that up there. But anyway, science and technology scholars remind us actually that many objects, real objects like Drosophila, right? Fruit flies, mice in the lab are actually human constructions, right? We've standardized them. We have bred them to actually be useful for us in the kinds of processes, the kinds of studies they want to do. I think in economics, we can think of in a very similar kind of way. We can think of Homo economicus. Is also a living, breathing manifestation of human imagination. We could think of it, well, on the one hand, it's an as-if, right? It's not there's no one suggesting that human beings actually behave exactly like Homo economicus. But at the same time, it's one of the things I'm going to argue today. In fact, many of the policies and efforts that have gone on, certainly since the late 70s and early 80s, have been about trying to create and produce a particular kind of rational economic action, to create a kind of Homo economicus, for whom the models will then start working. I'll get there. So, at the same time, that narrative I'm talking about, we actually produce, we're imagination, we produce fruit flies, we produce Homo economicus. I think it's too easy to grant ideas and expertise all the power, right? That we do that very easily, and somehow the power is all out there. But objects actually don't always behave the way that we want them to, even when they are partly human constructs. Again, I'm turning to a passage in a different book by Bruno Latour, Science in Action. He has this passage, this wonderful, grim passage, and he's talking about the tidy order of a lab, and how it can break down when the objects and devices don't do what they're supposed to. And in this case, the scientist that Latour is hypothetically watching, but the scientist needs to use a particular guinea pig gut in order to get certain kinds of effects. and do certain measurements. And at some point, the guinea pig gut is not behaving the way it's supposed to. And he says, oh, the scientist then says, oh no, it's a bad gut, it's a bad gut. And he dispatches the technician to go off there and sacrifice another little furry animal and remove the guinea pig gut and take it out and get this, get the experiment going again. And everything works again, but at the same time, that moment for Latour is a reminder of the friction of the material world, right? That these objects and things do not always behave the way they want them to do. So again, what does this have to do with economics? This would be one of my favorite examples of when theories do not work exactly the way you want them to. And if you look at this is IMF World Real GDP Growth Forecast, and you can see how you start in September 11. This is what it's going to look like. Oh no. Okay, this is what it's going to look like. No, this is what it's going to look like anyway. And this is the actual growth forecast, right? Actual growth. So again, year after year, right, there's an attempt to say, no, actually the world is going to behave this way. The world is going to behave, the model suggests the world is going to behave this way. And year after year, the world does not in fact do what people think or hope it's going to do. Okay. So friction and failure are a reminder of that. So, but even once we've done all that work, we have to take it out into the world. Even once you've figured out in the lab, you've got your model, you've got, how do you take it out into the world? And again, this is my last little bit of on random stuff from science and technology. So Latour has another book on Louis Pasteur, right? And he talks about the pasteurization of France, or the attempt by Pasteur to take his discoveries about inoculation out into the farm, out of this lab, right? Which is rather like the economic models, where everyone behaves the way they're supposed to, and you can standardize, right, and sterilize everything. Taking that out into the real world is actually very difficult. And how do you do that? Well, one of the ways you do that, in fact, is to remake the world, at least in part, so that it operates more like the lab. So you standardize, you sterilize, right? You try to make the world behave more like the lab. And what I want to argue, what does this have to do with economics again? Well, I want to argue in some ways this is what was going on in the late 1970s and early 1980s. This question of how to translate conservative economic, the economic models, the neoliberals and the new right wanted to pick up and put into practice, how to translate those into the world, how to make those work. Okay, how do you do that? Well, it actually involves a lot of hard work. It involves dismantling many of the earlier sociable practices and identities. You can go back and look at early speeches by Thatcher and others who were basically explicitly invoking Keynes and trying to challenge the idea that, for example, unemployment is a collective responsibility and a social experience, and saying, no, it's a personal responsibility, it's a personal, we individualize that responsibility, and therefore we are no longer as collectively as responsible to those people. So you have to challenge earlier sociable practices and identities and create new ones, create hyper-individualistic rational actors. And the other thing, you have to do that without a war or a Great Depression. Because the way that we managed to quite dramatically change practices the last time around, we got Keynesianism and the post-war consensus, was after 2 world wars and a Great Depression. So how do you do that without that kind of crisis as a crucible in which you're going to make those changes? I want to argue that to do that involves, I'm going to suggest that in order to do that, we need to look at this earlier stage. I'm going to suggest that it's about developing a new set of narratives, but it's also about creating a new set of models and devices, of projections and predictions. And this is, we're going to talk, drawing some interesting material out of the archives. So I want to go back to the sort of early glory days of neoliberalism and examine how key figures in the early 1980s sought to put key economic theories into practice. And this research, again, I'm going to talk about, happy to talk in more detail, comes largely out of archival work, the National Archives in London, the LSE Archives, the Hoover Institute, which is kind of amazing, has the files of Friedman, Hayek, and the Institute for Economic Affairs, which is a conservative think tank, the Library of Congress, the National Archives in Washington. I have not yet got to the presidential libraries in the US. It's very annoying. All the archives are mostly spread out, wherever the president has roots, connections. But it's still very much a work in progress. But that, I'm going to try to distill that for you and give you a bit of a sense of what was going on there. Okay. So what was the problem? Well, the problem that they were encountering in the late 70s and 1980s.
Oh, it's a national emergency.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Thanks.
Seth.
The problem, yeah, that was a big one. The problem is stagflation at this point, okay? So this has been a problem for some time, right? Policymakers have been struggling with it, first with inflation and recurrent inflation, then eventually it translated into stagflation. So high inflation and low growth, which policymakers really saw as a paradox of sorts, right? Normally they expected that there was a trade-off. You got one or the other. You didn't get both of these unfortunate situations at the same time. And this posed then a challenge to a lot of the existing orthodoxy. In the 60s and the 70s, they continued to try to respond with kind of Keynesian demand management on the fiscal side primarily, some monetary stuff. But over time also they increasingly relied on wage and price controls. It's easy to forget this going back. This is widespread, used in Canada, the US, the UK. The idea that government would get together with union leaders and business and they would all try collectively, without always a lot of success, some success, to moderate wage demands, to moderate prices, to control things that way. Now, if you're coming in as the new right in the UK and the US, you want to fix the problem of stagflation. You do not, though, want to go back to Keynes, and you certainly don't want wage and price controls, because that means working with labor, working with unions, strong unions. It means a highly interventionist bureaucracy. So the 70s, they're like constantly trying to see what's going on where, what unions are doing what. Like they're very involved in the labor market. They're very involved in all sorts of things that, again, at this point, these new figures are trying, one of the things they really want to do is dramatically cut the bureaucracy. They don't really succeed, but that's one thing that they want to do going in there. So how do you then fix inflation without going through these routes? They had this particular solution. This was the theory, okay? The theory is based on a particular kind of gamble. Okay? And the gamble was one of an idea of what you need to do is have dramatic action to shift people's expectations, change their inflationary expectations. So they would no longer keep expecting 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17% inflation, right? They would shift their expectations. And the hope was out of that, if you did this through a dramatic series of policies, you could actually end up with lower inflation without compromising growth. You would not have a massive recession, you would not have a lot of unemployment. This was supposed to be the kind of have cake, eat cake solution to these problems. Now, how that worked was through, this is again based on three key ideas. I'm going to explain in brief terms. But so first, monetarism. Okay, so a long-standing idea, the idea that you control inflation through the money supply, but revived by Milton Friedman. And the basic idea here is the belief that a government or a central bank control inflation by controlling the money supply, and ideally through some kind of simple rule that says, it's publicly announced, that says, this is how much the money supply will be increasing in the next year. So that's the idea. You don't try to manage demand, you don't try to deal with wages and so on. No, you just go straight, you simply try to reduce the amount of money in the assumption that the government can actually do that. That's a fundamental belief. Second theory that people may be less familiar with, the non-economists, rational expectations. And here, we have Milton Friedman, Robert Lucas is one of the key figures here. And Lucas's idea was to say, in the past, people have said, people's expectations change slowly. They're often, respond to what happened in the past. His argument was no. People actually, we can at least assume, again, for the purposes of our models, that people are going to update their expectations instantly and accurately, or at least very rapidly and accurately. And what that means is that if we can create a dramatically new credible policy on inflation, guess what? We can change people's expectations just like that. They can update their expectations and they will act accordingly. Okay, I'll explain why that's important. Finally, supply-side economics. Here we have Arthur Laffer, one of the more wingy advocates, but also very important in the early Reagan administration. I'm going to talk about that some more later. But here, the basic idea was the key to growth. The belief here was key to growth was working on the supply side, okay, generating more investment, not stimulating demand. And what that meant is that if you could target tax cuts to the rich in particular, you could actually free up more investment. And by stimulating growth in the economy, you could actually end up with lower taxes but higher government revenue, or at least avoid a major deficit, which of course is a ridiculous idea that we still hear a lot about today. But anyway, that was the thinking, enormously, of course, appealing to politicians. So I'm going to talk about those. And then, so we've got a gamble, some small ideas, and some specific devices that I'm going to be talking about, these concrete techniques. that ultimately did not go so well, but that we're supposed to translate these ideas into practice. And look at two, the medium-term financial statement from in the Thatcher administration and the budget, the 1981 budget projections for the Reagan administration. Technical, but I hope you'll see that they are actually very interesting. That's my gamble. Okay, so in the British context, the device that Thatcher and the Chancellor, Geoffrey Howe, ended up relying on was this idea of a medium-term financial statement, which is, again, whatever, MTFS, who cares? But actually what the goal was, it was one of the very first attempts to develop a kind of rule-based approach to monetary policy, which we still have adopted, have to some extent today. And the idea was that this was a set of quantitative targets for both the money supply, the rate of growth in the money supply, and government borrowing. And these are supposed to be publicly announced. So you need to tell everyone, you tell the markets, but you also tell workers, you tell unions, businesses, this is what we're going to do, and we mean business. Okay. So you can see here the two ideas that are being translated into practice. On the one hand, you have this idea that this is going to be, we can control inflation through the money supply. Paul Volcker famously said that part of his appeal, one of the reasons he was the Federal Reserve Chairman in the US, he said one of the reasons he did this was he thought it was simple enough that people could get their head around it, right? Just cut the amount of money and inflation will go down. People will understand it and therefore they will change their mind. Okay, so monetarism plus this idea of rational expectations being the belief that people will, because this is public, people will perceive it and they will shift their expectations. So you end up, in theory, with this virtuous cycle of credibility. People say, oh my goodness, this government finally means business. This is a serious government. They are really going to, they believe in sound money. They believe in low inflation. I believe this is going to happen. And so I'm not going to go out there and ask for a 15% wage increase, like I was going to yesterday. I'm going to go and ask for 10% or 5%, right? I'm going to moderate my wage demands. Or if I'm not going to keep ratcheting prices up or whatever if I'm at the other a business owner, I'm actually going to not only change my expectations, but change my behavior to match. And in the process, of course, I create a virtuous cycle. Inflation comes down, the government meets their target, and so on and so forth. It's a beautiful idea, okay? It did not work, however. How did the MTFS fail? Part of it was just the resistant world. Turned out the money supply was actually incredibly hard to control, and they were initially trying to target M3, a particular aggregate, and then it was clearly not working. All they'd be like, oh, this is not working. They started talking about other possibilities. There are a number of reasons. We can talk about the change in the velocity of money. Also the fact that they, at the same time as they were trying to control the money supply, they actually got rid of exchange controls, which dramatically changed how money operated. They also deregulated the financial system, as they did in the US, which dramatically changed how people decided to hold money. So they were not thinking, again, seeing this as a highly technical, not a social phenomenon. They didn't see that. It did not work. So the money supply didn't work. So then, because of that, they failed to meet their targets. Okay, so instead of having a virtuous cycle of credibility, they had a vicious cycle, right, where you didn't make your targets, and so your credibility was in fact undermined, and so people were like, oh, this is not going to work, and they started making higher wage demands, and so on and so forth. The other thing that's very interesting was a failure of nerve on Thatcher's part. And one thing that I found fascinating going to the archives is people always said the lady's not for turning. She did not do U-turns. She did, very early on. If you're going to be credible about keeping inflation low this way, right, one of the things you do is you are willing to keep, for example, interest rates going up however high it takes. That's what Paul Volcker did. You just keep going and you keep going. And you say, just test me. I will keep doing it, right? She very quickly said, no. You can see she tells the governor of the Bank of England, she's like, no, we've gone too far because business is suffering too much. And these are my constituents, and I can't let this happen. So she backed off that very quickly. So again, less credibility. And finally, the failure became particularly apparent when Britain fell into a very significant recession, the largest recession they had faced since the Great Depression, and also struggled for quite some time with high interest rates. This was a very difficult political situation that the government found themselves in. Why were things going so badly then? There's this wonderful memo from Sir Douglas Wasp. I was going to print, I'm not going to show you the link, it was long, and he's a permanent secretary in the Treasury, so he's the chief bureaucrat for monetary things. And he is always, all the way through, as you see the document, he's always skeptical about the medium-term financial statement. He is never convinced that that this is going to work. And then at one point, Thatcher comes to him and says, what is happening? Why is this all going so badly, right? And his basic answer is to say, on the one hand, he says, well, business misery is caused by the policy which is intended to slow the rate of inflation. In other words, our policy is creating this. Why are we miserable? Because we're doing this, right? We are causing this problem. We are trying to lower inflation, and there's going to be a cost to that. There's no magical fairy that's going to get us out of this. And then he also says there's no rational expectations fairy, which I love this quote, where he's like, I have never myself believed that the statement of the commitment to a deceleration in monetary growth would, through expectations, lead rapidly and as it were on its own account to a fall in wage settlements. So in other words, I don't believe that expectations will just dramatically change how workers behave. That's completely unrealistic. I've never believed it to be the case. He says eventually expectations might take over, but not. Initially, how is this going to work? It's wage settlements are going to go down as employers are forced to lay off workers, basically. That's how you do it. You cause massive unemployment. That drops wages because people will take whatever they're offered at that point. That is how you get inflation down. And that is, in fact, how they got inflation down. In other words, his response is, the way I read it is, of course, he doesn't say that because he's very polite and British, but he says, no, we made this mess. Why are we here? We made this mess. And kind of, I told you so. So how did Thatcherism work? Thatcherism worked the old-fashioned way. Okay, through a recession, you see what happens to unemployment. Oh, look, whoop. Okay, through a recession, through massive unemployment, fiscal cuts. So then they come in and they cut the budget on the fiscal side massively again, which creates a deflation. And ultimately, in the longer term, in her second mandate, through reducing the power of unions and pushing back on unions and dramatically cutting rates of unionization, so that workers can't actually organize to ask for higher wages, which is how it works. Okay. So how Thatcherism failed, how it succeeded. Rather differently from the theory. Second case, the US. And here I want to talk about the 1981 budget projections. So what were the 1981 budget projections to do? They were supposed to show basically how Reaganomics were going to work. It's like, here, let's show you. This is how it's going to work. This is our big, bold idea, our dramatic pitch, how we're going to change it all. Okay? So it's going to project this credible Reaganite future, where tax cuts would magically lead to growth. Monetarism would lead to lower inflation, right? So you get the two things you want at the same time, growth and lower inflation, right? The opposite of what they were facing. And this is going to be done partly by shifting expectations. Okay, so again, monetarism, rational expectations, and also here, you see the supply side logic in the British case also, but very central in the American case, this idea. And here, so again, Arthur Laffer, the basic idea being, that you can cut taxes on the wealthy without producing a massive deficit because you're going to stimulate the economy so much that it's going to catch up. Okay, and most Republicans at this point, this is not today, back then, most of them were still allergic to deficits. So if you wanted, your ideas supported in Congress, which was held by Republicans, you needed to make sure that you were not massively increasing the deficit. So for a sense of the logic of supply-siders' optimism, there's this quote by David Stockman, who was Reagan's first budget director, which I think is unparalleled. Okay, so what does he say? He says, this is how it's going to work. The inflation premium melts away like the morning mist, Stockman predicted. It could be cut in half in a very short period of time if the policy is credible. That sets off adjustments and changes in perception that cascade through the economy. You have a bull market in 81 after April of historic proportions. So he's projecting, right? He's saying, this is how it's going to work. It's going to be amazing, right? It's going to work so perfectly and so instantly. And this was in this brilliant article in The Atlantic. It is worth reading if anyone's interested in these things. It's a beautiful article where basically the reporter followed Stockman around, got his agreement, and followed him around for a year, meeting him every couple of weeks to just see what was going on, and basically watched Stockman's entire world fall apart. And many people think that Stockman lost his job as budget director once this article came out. So he starts out very optimistic, right? That does not last, however. Okay, so a little while later, he's saying, the supply-siders have gone too far. They created this non-political view of the economy, where you're going to have big changes and abrupt turns, and their happy vision of this world of growth and no inflation with no pain. So he is going on, budget director has to actually get the budget through Congress, and has to actually get all the members of Congress to agree on all these miserable cuts that are going to be painful for them, right? So it turns out they're much more supportive of this in theory than in practice. And then, this is what I love, little white light, it's like, none of us really understands what's going on with all these numbers. And in fact, one of the things Stockman did was he went in, he was given, and this is actually the case in both, I have another paper talking about this, both in the British and the American cases. These early neoliberal governments were confronted by numbers that said, your policies are going to so not work. They're going to produce, more, they're not going to get inflation down, they're going to create a recession and a deficit. And in both cases, the government said, we don't want to hear, And what Stockman did was he said, well, we're going to reprogram the computer, okay, because your numbers are wrong, because they're based on the wrong assumptions, and rational expectations changes everything, don't you know that, guys, right? So they changed the computers, and they produced these more optimistic predictions, but it wasn't enough. By late 1981, again, the US is in a major recession, and the deficit is starting to grow, and people could see that the deficit projections are getting higher and higher. So how did these projections fail? Well, it turns out the economists actually could not agree on that. They agreed that they needed to change the numbers and the assumptions, but they didn't agree how. So there's this fascinating memo from Beryl Sprinkle, who is the Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs, so the guy in charge of monetary affairs for Reagan. And he was a former Milton Friedman student, so he was a true believer in monetarism. And he writes this memo, why our initial forecast went wrong. He's writing this a bit after the fact, and he's trying to explain what happened. And he basically says, so why did their forecast, why does this budget not work? Well, he says the budget, these economists could not, in fact, agree. And they couldn't agree on things like how radical their assumptions should be. They couldn't agree on how fast inflation would decline, the stimulative effects of the tax cuts, the effects on the deficit. So for example, and you've got Greenspan, Alan Greenspan is there, Murray Wiedenbaum from the Council of Economic Advisors, Stockman was there basically. And one of the things he says is like they were afraid of spooking the market. So Alan Greenspan argued that these numbers should appear reasonable. They couldn't be too out of whack, right, or the markets would get anxious. The result was then they actually had to fudge. They came up, they invented a couple of where they basically projected highly unrealistic numbers in a couple of areas in order to make it all work out. But of course the markets were hugely skeptical, and they also didn't publish how they came up with those numbers. The markets were skeptical. Then a recession hits. And at that point, these projections start looking awful. It's like these are totally unrealistic. And you end up with political panic. This becomes politically unsaleable because Republicans are not going to support a set of policies that are going to produce this kind of massive deficit. And you get huge pushback from Congress at this point on the tax cuts, on interest rates. They're trying to rein in the Fed. All sorts of stuff is going on at this point. And there's actually one of the things I found that I absolutely love is there's these handwritten minutes from a meeting of the President's Economic Policy Advisory Board. So all these men, of course, are sitting around in a room, right, in panic mode. You've got Arthur Laffer, you've got Murray Wiedenbaum, the Council of Economic Advisors, Alan Greenspan, looking young and dashing. You've got Arthur Burns, former Federal Reserve Chairman, Arthur Schultz, who goes on to be Secretary of Trade, and of course Milton Friedman. They're all sitting there. They're all called in. They're meeting. They're trying to figure this out. And at that moment, they're trying to, what do we do about the deficit? What do we do about this? And even those like Friedman who argued deficits don't matter, like they shouldn't be inflationary. Even he's forced to admit that at least if markets at one point believe that they matter, then they are going to matter. They're going to end up eroding the credibility of the policy. So this is a moment where their models that they came up with are shaping the world, but not the way they expected, right? They are failing. They are profoundly transformative, but they are failing very, very significantly, and at this point are producing huge political problems for the Republicans. Okay. So how did these ideas fail? Well, monetarism wasn't working. The Fed actually gave up on it in 1982. Just said, that's it, we're not going to be targeting M1 money supply anymore. Supply-side economics also weren't working. The deficit kept growing. They ended up much actually bigger than even the worst-case scenarios that were starting to appear around in the early 80s. And rational expectations theory wasn't working. It turned out there was quite a lag in the shift in expectations, even with this dramatic policy In fact, people did not catch up. And there are internal memos where they're kind of starting to recognize this to some extent. But of course, again, to say Reaganism failed, Reaganomics failed, is to kind of miss the point. Of course, it was actually profoundly successful, right? But it was successful in a very different way. It was successful through a massive recession, a contraction, a huge increase in unemployment. Again, there's the increase in unemployment, and also by creating the conditions that we're living with now, where that's the moment where you see that this is the annual U.S. top share of the top 1%. Well, guess what? It picks up right around 1980, 81, and you start seeing inequality on the rise again. Profoundly transformative, but not for the reasons that that we often assume. Again, even though you've got people like Niskanen writing his biography of Reaganomics, saying this was largely that largely Reagan got inflation down through accident. I would say through accident, also through force in a sense. Okay. So finishing off, how then are failures quietened? Right? How are they made quiet? They're made quiet partly by narrating them as something other than a failure. So you see a couple of strategies. One, the classic one is denial. Oh, it wasn't a true test, right? So you have, this is Beryl Sprinkle, and you have Milton Friedman. Beryl Sprinkle goes around giving all these speeches as Undersecretary of Monetary Affairs saying, no, monetarism didn't fail. Milton Friedman says the same thing. And why? Well, because it's not their fault, it's the fault of the Federal Reserve Bank. It's actually the fault of Paul Volcker, who was not monetarist enough. And basically their argument is he got it wrong, he didn't do it right. So it was never a true test of real monetarism. And they have these very technical reasons why they think ultimately what Volcker did was wrong. Rebranding, which is probably one of the most powerful ways, right, is the idea of saying, no, we're going to rebrand it. So in the UK, there's a lot of saying, well, we don't do monetarism anymore, but we believe in sound money, right? And people describe that as political monetarism. We still believe in the same principles, even if the original actual ideas failed completely. What you see in the sort of conventional academic literature is this discussion of a new monetary consensus. So it's like, well, we're not there anymore, we've moved beyond monetarism, but there's something similar, and there's a kind of sense, the narrative, especially if you're reading like speeches from central bankers and so on, is a sense that we discovered the truth then, right, that we need rules and so on, and we've just been fine-tuning it since then. Rather than seeing it as like, actually there was a failure, there was an attempt we got inflation down by force, and then after that, this logic started taking over after that. And one of my favorite is the term dynamically efficient tax cuts, right? Which is supply side economics. But it's it's the Laffer curve again. But it's this idea again that somehow magically tax cuts will not make us all poor in the future. Okay, admission. You do see a bit of admission. Maybe it's a bit more complicated. You see some memos. But my favorite is Irving Kristol saying, who cares? We won anyway. And Kristol here is a new right. Mike Williams probably knows more about him. He's a neoconservative, right? Who is very conservative on military stuff, but also was a big supporter of supply side economics. A little while later, a few decades later, he's like, well, okay, so it didn't work, but you know what? We got what we wanted. We got, the big deficit caused government people to have to cut the kinds of things we wanted them to cut from the budget, as did, of course, the massive military spending, which was one of the causes of the deficit. And so we ended up with what we wanted, even if in the end, our logic was wrong. Doesn't matter. But I think the other one we really see a lot today is mythologizing. I think this is what really came to define the 1990s, which is where I want my research to go next. I'm always coming back to this. I was a parliamentary intern under the early Pétain years, and I still have to get my head around what we did in Canada, cutting massive austerity in response to the bond market crisis, which I'm happy to get into. But anyway, I still haven't figured out. But what we saw in the 90s was a lot of what was, I find, remarkable is many of the same parties that had condemned the failures of the conservative 1980s, and they did initially condemn them, and they argued that they were failures. But they ended up coming to accept the myth of their inevitable success, right? And they were the ones, I think, even more than Thatcher, used the language of there is no alternative. Certainly Blair was very fond of that logic, and I think we're still paying the price of that today. So, how do economic ideas work then? Well, they work by remaking the world like the model, okay? And to do that, they have to set up a self-fulfilling dynamic, right? They have to actually transform the world so that it behaves like the model. And this is not just ideational, right? This is not just, you can't just do this by saying, having the right thoughts. You actually have to do the work or be really lucky, which I think is what happened in this case, right? Or get there by accident and by other means, and then retell the story, right? But you need to create this self-fulfilling dynamic. And I think that's what the early Reagan and Thatcher years were about, right? They were about destroying the old and building this new, Homer economicus, anyway, I couldn't resist, this new way of thinking and being in the world. And the idea is that the clean, magical fairy dust way didn't work, and so you do it, the old-fashioned way, through what I like to describing as Keynesianism in reverse. But of course, I'm talking about failure, so it's not that simple. And I think that's why quiet failures are so interesting, that they show the difficult work of translating theory into practice and why that is not always as smooth. I think that's also useful because I think it complicates some of the smooth narratives that we tend, all of us, I think, tell about neoliberalism. We can have, the correctness of neoliberalism, the inevitability of it, the fact that it is, in fact, yes, this is the right way. Or the malign intentionality of neoliberalism, right? That all of this somehow was willed and thought through and entirely intentional, and all goes back to the Kelleran society. Again, too simple, too simple. The coherence of neoliberalism, that it is in fact that coherent internally, or that the theory and practice are that inherent. And of course the inevitability, it's, Energizer Bunny-like capacity to bounce back and to never disappear. I think that, so this was a quiet failure. I think it could have been a politically salient failure. One of the nice things about doing history is you always recognize the contingency of so many things. But I think Reagan and Thatcher were lucky. And one example would be the Falklands War. Did Thatcher get elected for economic success? I'm not an expert on that stuff. My sense is this played a huge part in her return to power. That often people get reelected, and then the narratives retrospectively told us that the ideas worked, but in fact, it can be for completely different reasons. And again, these were, of course, political administrations, but very good at combining the political, the military, the economic in interesting and unexpected ways. So what kind of successes then, to finish off? What kind of successes were these? Well, they did create a world in which these theories could sort of work. By accident, by brute force, at least for time, this logic of rule setting and expectations and so on did seem to work during the Great Moderation. But I think the 2008 global financial crisis really revealed how fragile these ideas are, how uncertain. What I find so interesting is that, it seems to be working in Canada, inflation targeting, but almost nowhere else in the world right now, right? They're mostly trying to create inflation, and they're trying, again, this constant adding on to the model, trying to think it through. No one's quite willing to say the emperor has no clothes. But again, you still have a sense that these ideas are teetering or are being dramatically and creatively reimagined, but often with unintended consequences. So again, I think we're in an era where we're seeing that failure. But at the same time, to me, what's so remarkable is that mythologization is still working. That's why we can't think so far outside of that box. And my question is really why? Why is that? Why are we so stuck in that way of thinking? Why do we keep telling ourselves that this has always been a long path of success when it's actually been much more fraught? I think if we can answer that, I think it'll be get some kind of clue to the hold that thinking has on political thinkers and actors today. I think that will also give us a better sense of how to break out of that thinking and maybe to remake the world and our ideas about it once again.
Great.